Last week, America lost one of the great giants of the civil rights movement in Congressman John Lewis of Georgia. He devoted his life to racial justice and equality, and of course he died just a little more than a week ago at the age of 80 of pancreatic cancer. As a young activist in March of 1965, Lewis led 600 people across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to demonstrate peacefully for the right to vote for blacks, but the marchers were attacked by state troopers who launched tear gas into the crowd and beat them with nightsticks. Lewis, who was 25 at the time, nearly died that day, suffering a fractured skull after he was beaten by a police officer. 55 years later, the young activist, now a congressman, remembered Selma's Bloody Sunday. "Do not get lost in a sea of despair," he said. "Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Good, necessary trouble." It's a pretty interesting definition of a prophet's call to upset the complacent, to demand justice from the ruthless, to open the heart of the self-centered, and to illuminate the vision of the prejudiced. For those of us that were able to watch the funeral services for him yesterday, it could have been really a master class about whether the United States has had its own prophets. Even the question that was raised in today's gospel, where did he get all this? Could be part of that experience. An echo perhaps of James Lawson's description of the early formation of Lewis as part of the meetings of the civil rights activists in Nashville in the late 1950s to plan the nonviolent strategy to address racial injustice. This was where John Lewis found his prophetic call. Here was the beginning of the wisdom that underpinned his long political career as someone who came to be called the conscience of the Congress. But he was not alone. Lawson sought to correct the historical record of the movement by citing the names of many of the men and women from around the country who had all received that same call, often in childhood, to work for an end to segregation and the social and economic structures that prevented Black Americans from taking their rightful place at the table of national life that was promised by the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. For those less inclined to find biblical themes in current history, the parallels probably are still worth considering. Today's reading from Jeremiah depicts a prophet who endured great suffering and rejection to fulfill a vocation that he could not turn away from once God had actually touched him. Jesus began his ministry by delivering his inaugural address in his hometown of Nazareth, reading the prophet Isaiah's vision of God's beloved community. Though his family and neighbors were amazed at his wisdom and mighty deeds, they still rejected Jesus. The demands of his message struck too close to home, which is the fate, really, of every prophet who speaks to his own nation and people. Go prophesy elsewhere, but do not ask us to change the deep-seated prejudices and cultural assumptions on which our pride and privilege rest. Jesus deliberately began his ministry by embracing the profile of the former prophets who never wavered from the truth they had received at their call. We should take consolation in affirming that Providence has had a hand in our national history and that so many voices have been imbued with biblical promise of a community in which truth and justice will prevail against the strong forces that don't share this dream for everyone. A living word comes to us in the example of others who also, in their insistent truths within our own hearts, about a kind of people that you and I want to be. The very doubts and fears that we feel about deep change really are actually a sign that real prophets are probably in our midst. It's their role to push us forward, even when it's difficult. The risen Jesus comes to us and says, "Don't be afraid. Come follow me." And so today's readings, I think, challenge us to realize perhaps our own baptismal call, the call to be a prophet. With the perseverance of Jeremiah and the optimism of Jesus, may you and I then be the prophets in our own words and witness to the love of God that dwells in our homes and in our community. Oh God, make us prophets then. Prophets of your compassion and peace in the simplicity of our own lives, in the quiet of our own homes and the ordinariness of our days. May we proclaim by our gratitude your goodness to all people, by our optimism your grace that can transform broken hearts and desperate lives, and by our selflessness your love in our midst.